Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on unlocking the impact of WCAG 2.2 on electronic documents. My name is Paul Reyes. I'm the Vice President of Training here at Alliant. As we get into our presentation talking about WCAG and how it impacts PDF documents specifically, I thought it would be a good idea to take a step back and look at a little bit of the history of WCAG, if you will. WCAG, of course, stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right? Some people pronounce that YCAG or WCAG. When you hear me say WCAG, that's what I'm talking about, is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So starting with WCAG 2.0, there were 12 guidelines and 38 success criteria. That's total at the single and double A levels, right? So one thing about the presentation today I want to make sure that we're clear on is I'm not really going to spend a whole lot of time on the triple A level success criteria and requirements, mainly because most entities, most organizations, clients, and so on need their documents, their websites to pass, be compliant, and so on at either the single A or most likely the double A level, right? So that's really where our focus is going to be for today's presentation. So that said, WCAG 2.0, there were 12 guidelines and 38 success criteria at the single or double A and double A level. And then in WCAG 2.1, there's now 13 guidelines, so one was added, and 51 success criteria, again, at the single and double A levels. And then with WCAG 2.2, there's 13 guidelines, so no additional guidelines, but now there's 57 success criteria at the single and double A levels. And then to make the math even more fun, one success criteria from WCAG 2.0 and WCAG 2.1 went away, right? So one went away and more success criteria were added. So let's take a little bit closer look at WCAG 2.2. Now this is in general, right? So what's new? The new success criteria for WCAG 2.2. There's 9. So most of them come in at the double A level, although there are a few or a couple that are triple A, and there's a couple that are single A level as well. So, but we'll take a quick look at them. Success criteria 2.4.11 and 2.4.12 are focused, not obscured. One is a minimum requirement at the double A level, and one is an enhanced requirement at the triple A level. And then similarly, there's success criteria 2.4.13, which is focus appearance. This is a triple A level success criteria. Then there's 2.5.7 dragging movements. This is a double A criteria. And then 2.5.8 is target size. This is 2.5.8 is the target size minimum requirement, which comes in at the double A level. And then 3.2.6 for consistent help. This one is at the single A level, right? So this is our first new success criteria at the single A level. And then 3.3.7, redundant entry. This is the second one that is new at the single A level. And then 3.3.8 is accessible authentication at the minimum level. And then 3.3.9 is accessible authentication enhanced. The minimum is double A level success criteria, and then 3.3.9, the enhanced for accessible authentication, is at the triple A level. Now, these are what's new in WCAG 2.2. And so most of these are going to be more applicable, for websites and apps and so on. So we'll break it down and look at what are the new requirements, the new success criteria that are relevant to our PDF documents, right? And again, just sticking to the single or double A level. there's really two that are going to be relevant. And then there's one success criteria that might be applicable to some of our documents sometimes. And then there's another one that really shouldn't apply, right? And we'll get into these. So the two that are really most relevant, the one is for target size, and this is probably the one that's going to be the most technical when it comes down to actually authoring documents or remediating PDFs, for example. And then the other one that's going to be relevant more frequently is the requirement for redundant entry. Now, this one's not too hard. It's not too technical. Pretty easy to meet the requirements, but certainly going to be relevant in some of our documents. Another one that might be applicable is the focus not obscured. All right, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about focus not obscured. And then one that really shouldn't apply is the one for consistent help. Right now, I'll touch on it just in case, but it's probably not really going to apply to the bulk of our PDF documents. So let's get right into things with target size. All right, some of the basics of this requirement. This is success criteria 2.5.8. It's target size minimum, not the enhanced one. This comes in at the AA level. And basically, to paraphrase W3C, the size of the target for pointer inputs needs to be at least 24 by 24 CSS pixels. We'll talk about that, right? I mentioned earlier that this is probably the most technical of the requirements. So we'll spend a little time talking about what really is 24 by 24 CSS pixels. But also important to note about this requirement, there are 5 exceptions that we will also discuss. So let's get into pixel size, right? What is 24 by 24 CSS pixels, right? Now, this is really technical, or it can get really technical. And granted, I'm not a graphic designer or anything like that. So pixel size and the math does get a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I'll try to explain it and also provide some resources for where you can learn more about this. The W3C has some awesome web pages to help explain this and help you understand it. But long story short, right, something's got to be, the target has to be 24 by 24 CSS pixels, right? So great. What's that? So 24 by 24 is 0.26 by 0.26 millimeters, right? If you, okay, so everybody bust out your ruler, 0.26 by 0.26 millimeters, or for those of us who are not on the metric system, that's about 1/96th of an inch, right? So we're not talking about massively large targets when we're talking about target size, but there is a minimum size that they need to be at. Of course, now one of the things that makes this technical, makes this interesting, is that it's based on a number of different factors sometimes. For example, viewing distance, and in fact, even the viewing platform, right? So, pixel size can change depending on different factors, right? For that more technical information, there's 3 links here in the presentation. The W3C, these links are all from the W3C. They've got great resources on understanding target size and pixels and so on, right? So there's a link for understanding target size. That that web page has a lot of information, lots of great screenshots and so on to really help paint the picture for, what are the requirements, what do they really look like, and there's past cases as well as fail cases, right, to really help explain this requirement. There's another link here, understanding target size CSS pixels, right, where they explain in even more depth what are we talking about when we refer to CSS pixels. And then from that web page, that one actually points to another one where they talk about reference pixels, right? Because different platforms and so on handle pixels differently, I guess. Again, this isn't totally in my wheelhouse as far as pixel size. Um, so there's reference pixels and CSS pixels and how they relate to each other. Lots of great information from the W3C, and we're going to make those links available to you. But that's a little bit on the pixel size anyways, as far as the requirements, right? So 0.26 by 0.26 millimeters or 1/96th of an inch. All right, so let's talk about target size in our documents, right? What types of documents will this be most applicable in? Most likely it's going to be your links, your documents containing links and forms, right? It's remember that it was the pointer input, right? So if somebody's trying to click on a link or click on a checkbox, for example, in a form, right? Those are going to be our targets, right? Now, links is probably going to be pretty easy to be in compliance with this requirement. If I go back to the previous slide, just to use the links as an example, the text understanding target size has been hyperlinked. Just the sheer size of, the length of those words, pretty much by default is going to make my link target there big enough, right? Or W3C understanding target size dash CSS pixels, right? That's pretty big, right? That's pretty long. So, decent sized target there. So in your documents with links, you're probably not going to have too hard a time meeting the target size requirement. Now, we'll talk about some exceptions to this requirement, but a certain situation that may come up in PDFs, for example, might be if there's a footnote reference that then is actually linked to the footnote, right? So that somebody can click on that reference, for example, and go straight to the footnote. Now that link, because it's a tiny footnote reference, it's a superscript number 1, for example, that might be smaller, right, than those other larger links that I was just referring to. But again, we are going to talk about some exceptions, and that may be one of those instances where you rely on an exception to get you out of trouble, basically, for not complying with the rule there. But the other situation where this could come up would be with our fillable forms, right? Now, again, text fields and drop down combo boxes and so on, probably not going to be an issue when it comes to target size. But what could be the issue with target size is checkboxes and radio buttons, for example, right? So those of you who are form designers might want to be, keeping this in consideration um, while you're designing forms. All right, now let's talk about some of the exceptions to the rule, and then we'll get into some examples for how to pass and how to fail, and break down one of these exceptions even more. So first of all, there's 5 exceptions, right? One is for spacing, and we'll come back to this because there's a couple of things to consider when you're looking at spacing as far as the exception to the target size rule. Another exception is it's labeled equivalent, right, on the W3C webpage. But if there's another accessible way to hit the target, then you may be exempt from the target size requirement, right? Inline is the next exception. So if the target is in the middle of a sentence, for example, or if the size is otherwise limited by the line height of the surrounding text. So this may very well be the exception that might apply to footnote references, for example, right? Because the tiny superscript number 1 pointing to the footnote at the bottom of the page, its size is limited, for example, by it's in the middle of the sentence, and the size might further be limited by if we got single spacing or 1.5 or whatever the spacing is in the document, for example. So that might be, so the inline exception may be where footnote or endnote references come into play. The 4th exception is for the user agent control. So this one, if the size of the target is determined by the browser or PDF viewer, for example, and not the document author, then this exception applies, right? So, for example, if Adobe Acrobat uh, gave the user the functionality to make link annotations bigger or checkboxes bigger while you're trying to read through a document and fill out a form, then that would be the user agent control, right? That the person who's filling out the form could make those annotations bigger and then be able to hit them, as opposed to the size being determined by the document author, the document creator. And then the fifth exception to the rule is if the target size is essential or is legally required, right? So basically, like if you have to have the target size, like legally, it can only be this big, then, well, legally, we got to meet legal requirements, right? So there is the exception for that. So the interesting one here, though, is the first exception, and that is for spacing, right? So uh, technically, I guess you are allowed to have targets that are too small, as long as they are spaced far enough apart, right? So how far is far enough, right? So we're going back to our 24 CSS pixels here. So the way to check the spacing to make sure that they're far enough apart. So let's consider the scenario where you have a bunch of checkboxes, maybe all in a line next to each other going across your document, or you have a series of icons that all act as links, right? Maybe at the bottom of your document, for example, you have the icons for Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, right? For example, it's just those icons that have been hyperlinked, right? So they're relatively small icons, but if the spacing is sufficient between them, then it's okay that they maybe are kind of small. So let's talk about the spacing, how to make sure it's okay. So what you do is you draw a 24 pixel diameter circle that's centered over each checkbox or each icon, right? So if you've got a series of icons, you draw your 24 pixel diameter circle centered over each one. So actually showing on the screen here, I've got a screenshot of a passing scenario where there are 6 icons, right, or 6 buttons on a web page, for example, and they're all relatively small, but they have their 24 pixel diameter circles drawn over the center of each one, and those circles do not overlap. Okay, so if the targets are small, but when you draw the circles over them to check their size, if those circles don't overlap, then you're okay, right? Now they can be really close, they could even be touching. As long as they don't overlap, you're fine. Now, up on this slide here, we've got similar situation, but this is the fail case, right? So we have the same 6 icons in the screenshot here. And again, I totally stole these screenshots from that web page from the W3C. So giving credit where credit is due. Thank you, W3C. That's a great web page on understanding target size, right? Um, but there's these 6 icons here. They have their circles drawn over them, right? They're 24 pixel circles drawn over each target. But in this case, the targets are close enough that the circles overlap, right? So in the pass case, the circles didn't overlap. So the fail case is that the targets are close enough together so that their circles overlap, right? They're too close. So spacing does not uh, get us out of trouble in this case. Another fail case here is one more similar to forms, for example. In the screenshot that I'm showing, there's 2 rows of buttons, or could be 2 rows of little text fields, right? Uh, Now the text fields or these buttons are wide enough, but they're not tall enough. They're only 16 CSS pixels high, right? So even though they're wide, they're too short. And between the 2 rows, there's only 1 CSS pixel gap between the buttons in the top row and the buttons in the second row, right? So when you draw your circles over the center of each of those buttons, um, again, the circles overlap. So when your circles are overlapping, that's when spacing is not sufficient. So in this case, even though the buttons are wide enough, because they're too short, remember, because it had to be 24 by 24, right? In this case, we've got 24 or maybe even bigger by only 16, right? So they're too short. So the circles overlap, so we're not meeting our requirements here. So these are just a one example, the pass case for size and spacing. And then a couple of fail cases. Again, that web page, Understanding Target Size from the W3C, has a lot more examples, breaks things down into much more detail and everything than we have time for here today. So I encourage you to check out that web page from the W3C. All right, so the next requirement then is for redundant entry, right? So we'll talk about the requirement first and then break it down. This is success criteria 3.3.7. It comes in at the single A level, right? So it's got to be met no matter what you're trying to reach, whether it's single A or double A, right? Redundant entry has to be met in your documents. Now, the rule is that information that needs to be entered multiple times in the same process is either auto-populated or is available for the user to select, right? Now, let's think about what this might look like in a document, right? In a document, maybe it's a banking document or a loan application or something, right? And so at the top of each page, there's a field where somebody's supposed to enter their account number, right? For the redundant entry requirement, instead of somebody having to manually enter their account number on every page, enter it on the first page, and then it automatically fills in the account number on subsequent pages, right? So that's one way to meet the requirement, is to have the fields automatically populated. The other way to meet this requirement is to make sure that that content, the account number in this example, is available for the user to select. Of course, then to copy and paste it right into subsequent fields. Right now, we'll talk about some of these scenarios and advantages, pros and cons to both approaches in just a second. But important to note that there are two exceptions to this rule. And the exceptions, one is for if re-entering the information is required, right? For example, to ensure the security of the document or the content. And the other exception here is if previously entered information is no longer valid, then the user should be able to input valid information, right? So those are the two exceptions to the rule. But let's talk about the auto-populated and then able to select requirements for redundant entry, right? Now, again, this is most likely going to be your text fields in fillable forms, right? Somebody enters their name or their account number, and then you want that to appear on subsequent pages, right? Or elsewhere in the document. Auto-populated, right? And somebody enters the account number once, and then it automatically fills in the other account number boxes. This can be done, and it's actually really easy to do. For example, in Acrobat, if you name text fields the same thing, then when you fill one out, they're all going to get that same answer that you just put into the text field, right? So, set up your loan application document where somebody enters their account number on page 1, page 2, and page 3, and so on. Those account number fields all have the same name, like account number. And then when somebody puts in their account number, it's going to automatically populate it on the subsequent pages. Now, this could be good, right? That's awesome, and it sounds super easy, and in fact it is, but there might be scenarios when you wouldn't want that to be the case. So as a form designer, for example, or somebody who's remediating a PDF and checking these things out, you want to make sure, is that correct? Like one scenario might be if you're working on a financial document again, but it's related to a couple of different accounts. So on page 1, you put in one account number, but then on page 5, right, where you're starting to answer questions about a second account, you wouldn't want, you wouldn't want that account number from page 1 entered in there as well. Now, this would be easy to set up. It'd be just account 1, and then on page 5, you've got your text field for account 2, right? They're not named the same thing, so that's not going to autofill. But another way around that would be to use the second way to meet this requirement is to able to select, right? Being able to select the text, the account number in the field, and then copy and paste it, right? So somebody could navigate into the first field, copy the account number, and then when they get to page 2, navigate to the account number field and paste that account number in, and continuing answering the questions on page 2. Now, of course, the drawback to this is, if somebody puts in their account number on page 1, not realizing perhaps that they're going to have to enter it multiple times, and then they answer a bunch of questions on page 1, and then they get to page 2, and they're met with the account number box again, right? That text field. So now, if it's not auto-populated, they have to go back to the beginning of page 1, copy that text, right? So we're talking about navigation here, where navigating back and forth could be cumbersome. Find your way all the way back to that first account number text field, copy it, get yourself to page 2 to fill it in again, and so on. So there might be scenarios where you would want to or need to use the able to select copy and paste option, but you might want to think about setting things up so that auto-populated takes care of that heavy lifting for you, right? But that's a couple ways to meet the redundant entry requirement. So the next one is focus not obscured. This is at the minimum level. This is success criteria 2.4.11. And what this is when a user interface component receives keyboard focus, that component should not be entirely hidden by author-created content. So this is the focus not obscured minimum requirement. The enhanced requires that components aren't hidden at all, right? But for the minimum requirement, it's that the component should not be entirely hidden by author-created content. Now, let's face it, in a real-world scenario, in your PDFs, this probably isn't going to be an issue, right? From the authoring perspective, don't put stuff on top of other stuff, and then this isn't going to be a problem, right? Don't bury your buttons or your links or your form fields underneath text or images or whatever, and you're going to be fine, right? So again, probably not going to be an issue in PDF. However, and this is probably maybe even easier to meet in Word, might want to pay attention to what's going on. For example, in PowerPoint, where it's easier to put something on top of something else, right? If you're putting together a beautiful looking slide, make sure that you're layering, you're not hiding things, right? Or in InDesign, for example, where you have a little more control over where stuff goes on the page, right? Make sure that you're not hiding things, and then you're going to be fine, right? So again, it's relevant to our documents, but probably not going to be that big an issue. Now, the one that might be relevant to our documents, but shouldn't be an issue really at all, especially if we're using good authoring practices, is consistent help, right? This is success criteria 3.2.6. It does come in at the single A level, right? However, really shouldn't be applicable to our documents if we're authoring with just good authoring practices. The requirement, though, is if a document has any of the listed help mechanisms, right? And the W3C on their understanding for this requirement, or even in the standard itself, it lists the help mechanisms that they're talking about. But if the document has any of the listed help mechanisms and they repeat on multiple pages in the document, then those help mechanisms have to appear in the same order relative to the other page content, right? Unless, of course, the user can change that. So just like going back to, target size, and if, for example, Adobe Acrobat allowed the user to resize link annotations, right, or checkboxes, right, to make the target easier to hit. In a PDF, if you were able to change the order of content in the document from the end user perspective, then this wouldn't be an issue. But from the authoring perspective, if you have these help mechanisms on multiple pages, they have to appear in the same order, right? Now the help mechanisms that W3C talks about is how to contact somebody, phone numbers and addresses and so on, or various self-help options, right? Or links even for automated help, right? Those are the help mechanisms specifically that they're talking about. Now, again, this really shouldn't be an issue in our PDFs, right? Now, I'm not saying in your PDF that you're not going to include links, for example, to, hey, how do I get more help if I need it, right? That would be appropriate, perhaps, to put in a document, especially if it's like a training manual or something, right? Hey, if you need help, contact us here, right? However, you're probably only going to have that once or maybe twice in a document. It's not going to be recurring help that's available on every page in a PDF, right? So again, coming back to the author, if you're authoring, you know, thinking about what you're doing, then this probably isn't going to be an issue, right? Now, and that's basically it. Now, there might be other things. Sometimes there's content in footers that repeats or headers that repeats and so on, but that's not what this requirement is about. It's about consistent help specifically. All right, so hopefully that made sense. Now, our last checkpoint that we'll talk about here is the checkpoint on parsing. Now, this is success criteria 4.1.1. What's interesting about this one, this is the one that was removed from WCAG 2.2, but it is still in WCAG 2.0 and WCAG 2.1, right? The reason it was removed from WCAG 2.2, basically, is that the rationale was if your web page or your document fails for parsing, then it probably also fails for something else that's already a requirement in WCAG. So, there's no reason to give people two failures for one issue, right? So flag the real issue that it is, fix it there, and then you don't have to worry about parsing, right? Now, this might still be relevant though if you yourself, your organization, your clients, whoever, if they want your PDFs to be compliant with WCAG 2.0, right, for Section 508, for example, in the US, and WCAG 2.2. So parsing is still a valid requirement for WCAG 2.0, right? So you're still going to have to validate against that checkpoint if you're testing against WCAG 2.0 or WCAG 2.1, right? But it is removed from WCAG 2.2. So the parsing rules, just so that we're all on the same page here, for content using markup language, elements have to have complete start and end tags. Now, in a PDF, you would have to like really purposefully try to mess that up. So it's probably not going to be an issue in your PDFs, right? But it's one of the listed rules for parsing, so mentioning it here. The second rule is that elements are nested according to their specifications, right? Now, this might be taken out of WCAG 2.2. However, it still actually is a PDF requirement that tags are nested correctly, right? PDF UA, for example. So even if it's removed from WCAG from WCAG in WCAG 2.2, again, still might be valid. But if you're using, for example, Common Look PDF or the Common Look PDF validator to test your PDFs to make sure that they're accessible and standards compliant, then we're going to test the nesting rules to make sure that you are playing by those nesting rules, right? So you should be okay. Or if you're not, the software will flag it so that you can then go fix it. The third requirement for parsing is that elements do not contain duplicate attributes. Now, this is one of the ways where PDF maybe differs from web pages and WCAG requirements and so on, because if it's appropriate for the content in PDF, you actually can have elements that have duplicate attributes, right? And then the fourth requirement here is that IDs are unique, except where specifications allow for IDs to be the same or not be unique. Now, PDF UA requires that for example, tags that have IDs, that they have unique IDs, right? And again, a PDF validator like Common Look PDF or the Common Look PDF validator are going to check that and catch it. So if you have parsing issues in your documents, then if you're using, again, Common Look PDF validator, you should be able to test those and find out whether or not you are in compliance with those requirements. So that, my friends, in a nutshell, is WCAG 2.2 and how it relates to your PDF documents. If you would like more information, please feel free to reach out to us at info@alliant.com and shoot us an email, send us your questions, and we'll be sure to follow up and answer them. So thanks for coming. And with that, I'll check the chat here and see if there are any questions in the chat. And in fact, there are. So yep, a couple questions here. Can you send us the link to WCAG 2.2? So sure, be happy to drop that into the chat for you. And also somebody's asking the link to understanding target size, right? This is a great web page. So sure, here you go. Here is the link to the W3C's page on understanding target size, right? Somebody else says they missed it here on the slide for 2.4.11. Focus not obscured. Was that at the single or double A level? Yeah, sorry about that. I just inadvertently left that off that slide further down in the deck, but it is a double A requirement, right? So focus not obscured was at the double A level. And then consistent help. Question here, does that also apply to things like repeated TOC like buttons at the top of every page in a document? This is a great question. We've seen this, right? Some of us have seen this where at the top of every page, there's kind of like web page where there's buttons or there's links to the different chapters in the document, for example, like a little mini table of contents at the top of each page. So this is a great question. Thank you for asking this one. Technically, no, consistent help does not apply to these little repeated mini TOCs at the top of your pages. It only applies to the help mechanisms, right, that the W3C lists on the web page. Human contact details, contact mechanisms, self-help options, or fully automated contact mechanisms, right? So those are really what it applies to. So it doesn't apply to those little mini TOCs that sometimes people put into their documents. However, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to come back to the good authoring concept, right? Please don't put those little mini TOCs in your documents. A table of contents is fine, right? Don't get me wrong. A table of contents at the beginning of the document is great. Even in longer documents, you might have table of contents like at the beginning of each section, right? If they've got long sections, for example. Those are fine, no problem with that. But what I'm talking about is don't put those little buttons at the top of every page for little mini TOCs, right, to navigate to the other sections of the document, right? These can be really problematic. For example, if you've got a list or a paragraph or a table that spans multiple pages, right? If you've got buttons or those links there at the top of every page, they have to be tagged because there's annotations there, right? So they have to be tagged. They can't be artifacted as just headers. But at the same time, then that can break apart your paragraph or your list or your table or whatever that is spanning across the page break, right? So again, from an authoring perspective, please don't do that. There's other ways to provide navigation, right, to people. There's headings, right? People can navigate through the document based on the heading levels or use the bookmarks, or again, table of contents at the beginning of the document or at different sections along the way is appropriate, just, not at the top of every page. So anyway, rant over on that one. But that was a great question. Thank you for asking. The consistent help only applies to the help mechanisms that the W3C lists in 3.2.6. All right, so that looks like that's it, I think, for the questions. So again, thanks for coming. Hopefully you found this helpful and informative. And should you want to contact us for any more information, please reach out to us at info@alliant.com. Thanks.